published researcher, artist, keynote, and innovation speaker who is fast becoming the voice of Generation Z. Having partnered with global multi-billion-dollar companies like Microsoft, eBay, Walmart, she helps leaders be at the forefront of the future of innovation and inclusion for Generation X. Please welcome Apoorva.
Hi.
So Apoorva, first question we're going to ask is, okay, I'm excited because I want to know, how did you get started in what you're doing today?
Well, I would say that probably the first big turning point was when I was 12 years old. I was on this TV show called Genius Junior. It was this NBC national TV show hosted by Neil Patrick Harris. And I basically did like things like calculations, like geography rounds, spelling rounds. But the really amazing thing about it is it gave me this like enormous visibility in front of millions of people, that really was just a once in a lifetime opportunity to talk about things that are really passionate to me, like gender bias in STEM and how we can encourage younger girls in STEM.
Yeah, when you mentioned that name, I was like, oh, yes, science, yes, at its best. So, yes, and you've been on a TV show. I love it. I love it. So let's talk about it. Now, I think you mentioned that you may have become a human calculator. Can you, elaborate on that? Just I'm curious, how does that come about? And what is a human calculator?
Yeah, so it was kind of this like cute little nickname I got on the show because I was really good at doing mental computations in my head. So like when I was younger, I learned how to use this ancient computation device called an abacus. And it's just a different way about thinking about all the operations. But it's more intuitive if you learn it when you're younger. So it means I'm able to calculate sort of complicated equations in my head like fairly quickly. So that's just where the nickname came from.
So by having that nickname, what advice do you have for students who may be struggling with math? And how can we make math more accessible and engaging for all those learners?
Yeah, so I think the biggest problem with math education right now is that it's taught in a really boring, really tedious, like matter of fact way to younger kids. And it just seems like there are no applications at all, which is crazy to me because we use math in every single discipline, every single field. But I can totally relate. Like I did not enjoy learning math in my elementary school because it didn't seem clear to me like what we would ever be using this for. And so like on the computation side, it's kind of like a flashy way to see math, which is like, oh, you're so quick, But on the other hand, my advice for younger students would be to, not discount math right away. I think find ways you can relate to it. So I'm an artist. So some of the ways I relate to math is like I use proportion or perspective in my paintings and drawings. And I actually have a column called Gems in STEM where I try to make math accessible to lots of different fields. So like if you're really into music, I have an article called The Many Symmetries of Tessellation's Feet Harry Styles. Why? Well, you have to read it to find out. But like intertwining pop culture and things you personally are really passionate about into subjects like STEM can make it more interesting, I think.
Wow, I love how you correlate it and put it in perspective. It is everyday life. And that's the thing I think kids and students need to be able to realize that every day we are around math, and it's all important from that end. Now, we talk about gender bias. And so how can we address gender bias in early STEM education and try to encourage girls to pursue STEM careers? Can you share any personal experiences that you maybe or successes stories in this type of area itself?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think like understanding how to address gender bias, we have to first look at some of the root causes. And one of those big things is that we don't learn about gender diverse role models like early enough. Like, for example, when did you first hear the name Einstein or like Newton or Galileo? we learn these names really young because they're very important STEM figures. But for example, when did you hear about Ada Lovelace, who's the first computer programmer, or Katherine Johnson? Like, to be completely honest, I didn't know about Katherine Johnson until like Hidden Figures came out, and I learned about her inspiring story and all those people. And so I think really making sure education is interdisciplinary, very diverse, and it reflects the real world. Like, the reason that we don't know about these figures is not because they don't exist. It's because we're not telling teachers to teach about them. And then some of the other like important reasons for gender bias is that like stereotypes and STEM anxiety are passed down from trusted adults. So some of the things we need to do is first address our own unconscious or own subconscious biases, and then have conversations with our kids about them. As for like my personal experience with it, as a girl in STEM, unfortunately, there have been like lots of examples of me growing up not really feeling like I belonged in math or belonged in STEM. Like, I've had like peers tell me that, I'm not going to succeed in a math competition because of my gender or things like that. And I think the most important thing for us to do is just like address these biases early on and show young girls and young gender minorities that there are role models who exist and that the path is well paved. Like, you have a place no matter where you are in STEM. And I think that has been the most rewarding to me, is seeing like older women STEM figures like yourself, like doing their thing, like pushing the needle. So I think that's the best thing we can do.
Love it. I mean, you're smart, intelligent. Yes, I love it. I love it. So what do you think are some of the biggest challenges? You talk about Generation Z, representing that, as far as that they face, especially, I mean, going from school to then trying to look for college to then, to then the workplace. What are some of the biggest challenges you think they might, and is there any specific skills, that they maybe should, start working towards or utilizing in that generation?
Yeah, that's a really amazing question that I think like companies really have to be asking right now, because like Gen Z is like no other generation. We're digital natives. We grew up around technology. We're very familiar with it. But it also means that we've seen firsthand the effects that it has on us and our relationships with other people and our lives and how we learn. And so unlike what a lot of people think, like Gen Z values personal connections, in-person connections a lot more than older generations think, because, we have this emphasis on online relationships and friendships through social media, but we see that it can't really replace in person, as we've seen from the pandemic, right? So we really value personal connections, but right now Gen Z is the least happy generation at work, because our work is tied to how passionate we are about the work that we're doing. So I think these are like some of the biggest challenges, is how do we find work that we're passionate about doing? And how do we align with like current managers or leaders at these companies to make sure that there's no sort of mismatch? Because, there's lots of myths about Gen Z, right? There's the myth that, we're lazy. We don't want to work, like we're job hoppers, like all these sorts of things. But I think it all kind of boils down to, we just want to be in environments where we care about what we're doing. We're not only earning a paycheck, but we find meaning in our work. And some of the things that we value are like diversity and inclusion, companies taking social responsibility, like environmental impact. And so I think like the skills that we need to be focusing on in this age of like rapid technological advancement. I feel like every week there's some new AI tool or AI thing that has come out. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what's happening? Like, it's completely disrupting everything. So I think like skills are becoming almost outdated, because if you try to get these skills before going into the workforce, like it's moving fast enough that these skills can become obsolete really fast. So I think the emphasis should be placed on like the ability to pivot and learn and adapt very quickly to new ideas and new technologies. And I think like our education needs to be reformed around this idea of like mindsets and like this like eagerness to learn, rather than like learning these languages or learning like these specific skills before we go into the workforce.
I love it. I'm glad that you was able to break it down, because I think sometimes we talk about generational differences and you got all the different, categories of the different generations and trying to understand each other. I think is the biggest piece in the workforce. So I'm glad you was able to, the myths the things about them and break that down. So I'm glad you was able to do that. So talk to me. I mean, you're a published researcher, you're an artist, a keynote speaker, innovation expert. So what advice do you have for young people who aspire to make a difference in their communities and beyond? Like, yeah.
Yeah. So disclaimer, I'm still, like very young. I'm figuring things out. So I'll give the advice I can best give at this point in time. And that might change. But I think for me, the biggest thing has been idea of hope is more important now than ever, with like climate change and like global news. It's all like very sad and almost like kind of destructive things that I think a lot of my generation is feeling kind of like hopeless when we look into our future because there's so many problems that we need to be fixing. And I think like finding meaning in the work that we do and finding hope in our world is one of the most important things we can have to keep moving forward. And on the idea of like being curious about how things work around us, about like ourselves too. Like I think we need to be very like introspective and learning and kind of reinventing ourselves, because I think like right now, like the age I'm 18, it's like, oh, I need to find myself, I need to find my identity. But I think it's more about like forming your identity. I feel like you can reinvent yourself at any point of time. Like for example, I am not an athlete. Like I never thought I could like run more than a mile. But after the pandemic, I was like, oh man, I haven't realized like how important it is to just move around every day, right? And like get some sun. So I started running and I'm training for a marathon in May. So in like a month. So it's like kind of a big leap. But it's really just like sometimes we tell ourselves things about ourselves, and they're not necessarily true. Like we don't have to box ourselves in. But yeah, like the underlining thing is just to, be curious and be hopeful.
Love it. Love it. And so, sometimes we do make some mistakes. Is there any what's maybe one biggest mistake you've made with the journey itself, that, maybe you can maybe share that you've had, or others make, when it comes to trying to tie in with STEM, trying to get to this point of wanting to be a part of STEM? Would you be able to share any of that as well?
Yeah, I think like there's this sort of theme about the mistakes I make, which is like not caring about myself enough or prioritizing myself, which is like during the pandemic, when you're home and there's not really much else to do except like work or like sleep. I like overworked myself. I didn't think about burnout. I didn't think about like time management. And it kind of felt like if I took time for myself, it was like wasting time. And so I also think like what I just talked about, which is about putting myself in a box and, imposter syndrome and feeling like I'm not enough. These have all stopped me from doing things that I would otherwise be capable of doing or doing things that maybe like I never imagined I could do. And so I think like we shouldn't be the ones limiting ourselves. Like there's no like downside of putting ourselves out there and maybe getting rejected, but also maybe it turns into something you could have like never imagined before, right? Like for example, like when I was younger and I went on that TV show, like maybe I didn't like take the chance on going on this. Like I was really young, like it was a little scary, it was a little intimidating, but I was like, what's the worst that could happen? And so it turned into something I could have never imagined. So I think just taking chances has been like the most important thing.
Love it. So what's one thing you maybe could share? One thing people could start right away to get going with what we've been talking about. What is maybe some advice from the kids to the parents? Like what is maybe one thing people can start doing right away?
I think we all have something that we've been meaning to do, but we keep putting it off. Like, oh, when I have more time, when my like kids go to college or when like I'm less stressed, when there's less going on. Like, why don't you just start now? Like even if it's 10 minutes a day, 5 minutes a day, you're making progress, right? Just like thinking about it, working towards it is progress, even if it isn't fast progress, right? So I think like something we can all start doing now is just taking tiny little steps towards our goals, because once we start working towards them, they become like real tangible things in our lives. They become things we can actually prioritize rather than an idea that's sort of just been floating around for like months or years. Yeah.
Love it. Love it. So talk about some tools. What is maybe any tools that you could provide to help with this talk that we've been doing today? Are there any tools that maybe you could provide?
I think for me, like what has been really helpful is like time blocking. It's become more popular, I think, in terms of like time management, which is like looking at your calendar and figuring out times that you want to do this, you want to do that, just to add some structure to your day. But on the flip side of that, I think like it's a mistake to over construct your day. I think a lot of people can feel like disappointment or shame if they don't follow these blocks for themselves. So like what I do is I will like give myself a lot of leeway, like be very kind to myself and say, okay, I'm going to go on a walk. I'm going to do art. I'm going to prioritize the things that I wouldn't prioritize if I was in like work mode, right? Like things that are for me are to make sure that I have like peace of mind. And then around those things, you can put your work. And so when you sort of flip the script of first putting in the things that maybe aren't so important, then you kind of find like those pockets of like, you know, time for yourself in your day, and making sure that you don't lose those throughout the week.
Love it, love it. So we're winding down and just wanted to see, okay, how can people get in touch with you? Is there a way to get in touch with you? Because you're all about STEM, you're all about trying to encourage. You mentioned some nuggets of things, because when I was saying the tools you provide, you've got some tools that you also can provide. You said you do. So please share that, as well as how can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, so I would love it if you wanted to connect with me. So I have a newsletter that I send out every month about all the stuff I'm up to, projects like artwork, interesting events like this. So that's apurvapanidapu.substack.com. But if you search up my name, it'll probably come up. My name is actually like entirely unique because of like a spelling error however many decades ago. So if you just look up my name, everything will come up. You can also like I have on Medium the column I was talking about, Gems in STEM. So you can check that out if you want to see how math can be interesting in our everyday lives. And like on LinkedIn or any social media platform, you can just search up my name and I'm there.
Love it. It has been a pleasure talking to you. I mean, you're smart. Your future is so bright. It's already bright. So I'm looking forward to how the future is going to be moving forward with you. So I just thank you for allowing me the opportunity to allow you to share with the world as far as all the things you're doing, some great advice, breaking it down from the Gen Z. So thank you for taking the time to talk with us today.
Yeah, thank you for letting me be a part of it. I'm super excited to hear from the other speakers. And yeah, this is like such a fun conversation. I'm glad to be here.
Love it. Love it. Thank you.